Well, hello, Missouri Folklore Society. I am so glad that uh, we have a chance to have a bit of a meeting this year. I want to say a huge, gigantic thank you to Adam for keeping this meeting on track. Um, I know it's been a huge extra task for you, Adam, and I really appreciate that you hung in there for this. Actually, I think that as things have continued down this wacky path of self isolation that we're following, that our connections are even more important than ever. And folklore and history can certainly help us remember those connections and build those connections in a good way. So I think that this technology, the Zoom and the YouTube and such, are going to be increasingly important. And not only that, but as we learn what we can accomplish without traveling, without starting our cars, um, it's all good for the planet. And we've used enough fossil fuels in our lifetime to actually change the climate. So, well, that's another soapbox. This presentation, of course, we were supposed to be meeting in Hannibal, and this presentation is about one of the collections in particular that we will see next year when we gather in Hannibal. And so I will get it started, I hope. Hope. Yeah. Um, oh, wait a second. I haven't done the share screen thing. Okay, let's share the screen here and let's get this going. Okay, now we're cooking. Uh, this is one of the historic sites that we will see in Hannibal, and this is the one that has the collection that I'm going to be talking about. This is presentation was inspired by work I've been doing to try to understand the Clemens women as examples of the Victorian culture, and that culture still continues to influence us today. I want to give a big shout out to Marianne Bodine of the Mark Twain Birthplace Historic Site in Florida, Missouri, and this is a picture of it. She very generously gave up her time to help me gather the information about some of the many, many artifacts in the museum. I hope that Marianne and I can continue to work together and again work in person together. It turns out that Missouri owns a lot of artifacts from the Clemens family, and most are housed in the collections in the Mark Twain Birthplace Historic Site, which is this site right here, and the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum in Hannibal, which is, of course, several historic buildings. Whoa, come on, move along here. There we go. Um, the historic site would not have what it has without the help of Clara Clemens, and this is a picture of Clara as an adult, of course, and Miss Maureen Nichols, one of her friends, and Sam, and obviously he's playing the harmonium, I guess. There were 4 births to Olivia Langdon Clemens, who was Mark Twain's wife. Clara was the 3rd born and the only one that survived her father and mother. First came a son, Langdon, and that was, of course, taking the name of Livy's family. Susie was named for Livy's sister, and she was a healthy young baby and was, according to the biographers, their favorite. Clara was next, and she was born just as they were moving into their house in Hartford, Connecticut. And then the last baby was Jean, and both Susie and Jean died when they were in their 20s. So Clara, as the survivor, became the keeper of the family heirlooms and also the keeper of the reputation of Mark Twain, along with his biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine. Clara made sure that only the sunniest memories made it into the canon that we accept as the life of Mark Twain. She devoted herself to guarding his reputation, which of course depended on an image of her father as happy, adventurous, harmonious, gentlemanly, and humorous. Just a few of the adjectives that seem to fit him. Clara was named for Clara Spaulding, her mother's best friend, and they called her Aunt Clara. She was single much of her life, and she spent a lot of time at the Hartford house and also went with the family on at least one long trip to Europe. The naming of Clara and the close relationship reminds us that Victorian women, while isolated in their homes, still had active social lives and formed very close friendships. In fact, during much of their marriage, Livy and Sam were in completely separate places. In fact, separated by an ocean. Uh, Sam loved travel, and the Clemens family finances were often sketchy. It was cheaper to live in Paris or any European city than it was to live in Hartford with 7 servants. So when they had to leave Hartford because of finances, Sam took them to Europe. Because Livy was a wealthy woman in her own right, the herself and her children got by. For years, Sam lived mostly in the United States, playing the role of what one socialite called the Belle of New York. Back in Europe, the girls were sheltered but exposed to the best entertainments. Clara wanted to be an opera singer. She took lessons from the best European teachers, but she accepted pretty early in her career that she did not have the voice to sing operatic leads. She made a career singing performances that were, a couple of hours long and included well-known arias along with folk songs, but she could take a day off between each performance. In 1906, she married Osip Gabrilowitsch, a skillful pianist who eventually became the conductor of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. And so his career was financially good enough that Clara and Nina their daughter, were comfortable. Osip died in 1936, and Clara married again in 1944. And this time her husband was less successful, and he was, in fact, a gambler who made promises he was not able to keep. Because the popularity of Mark Twain works continued, the couple, Clara and Jacques, were able to auction or sell off anything that seemed attached to the great writer. One set of letters went to a stamp collector, and others went to collectors that loved Mark Twain. And those eventually found their way to legitimate archives, mostly at the University of California, Berkeley, and then other archives on the East Coast, where Livy's family had a long history. And fortunately, the family was quite prolific, and there were plenty of letters and manuscripts to go around, which brings us to the Missouri collection. And I want to emphasize that, in my opinion, the Missouri collections are more important, or at least as important, to students of women's history as they are to students of Mark Twain. In these collections, some, but very few, comparatively few items belong to Mark Twain personally. This is a couple of shots of the cabin, which started the Missouri collection. And the bottom left, you will see the cabin as it stood in Florida, Missouri. A fellow named Dad Violet was owner of much of the Florida, Missouri land, including the cabin. And he realized that the cabin was valuable and it should be preserved. And I should mention that Howard Marshall, by the way, says in his book, Folk Architecture in Little Dixie, University of Missouri Press, that there was a front and back porch on the building. Anyway, it was an expensive proposition to put the cabin in a space where it could be preserved. It actually ends up in its own building. Fundraising to purchase a protective building began in 1923, and some of the money was raised at concerts performed in Missouri by Clara Gabrilowicz. Ossip was busy. She had another uh, pianist accompanying her, and their appearances in Missouri created a huge stir. They went to Hannibal, Paris, Moberly, Mexico, Louisiana, Fulton, Sedalia, and Kansas City. The concert in Paris was her most successful, money-wise, raised several $100s. And as Marianne Bodine says, partly because the local newspaper kind of strong-armed the residents to be there and pay more for their tickets. And the series was topped off with a concert in Washington, D.C. Mark Twain State Park was established in 1924, and it was the third Missouri state park to be established. Now, Clara gave the state a wonderful gift in 1924 also. She donated this carriage, which is described as a town-type carriage used by Mark Twain when he lived in Hartford. And it would fit my thesis perfectly to say that this is a very memorable carriage to the family, but we can't find the connection. It's not recorded anywhere. There was a carriage in the Mark Twain family when Mark Twain took daily rides, and on one of these rides he had his son Langdon with him, and Langdon was a frail child, was very cold. The blanket covering Langdon fell off, and he got back to the house half frozen, and that led up to his death. Mark Twain lived with that story and that nightmare for all of his life, but it's really not recorded by the servants or Livy or other people. So it's hard to say whether exactly how that happened. But anyway, the buggy was really the first of the gifts, many gifts that Clara gave them. And at the same time, there was a group of folks meeting, and these were gentlemen, fans of Mark Twain, meeting in Detroit for lunch. They were called a luncheon group. And in 1939, they realized that Henry Ford's Greenfield Museum was looking for homes connected with famous writers. And they thought, ooh, gosh, they're going to come and get that little cabin. So they started to work right away to establish a Mark Twain Foundation. And it began by publishing the Twainian, which is really an interesting read. There's a huge collection of it at the museum, and it published many letters and details of Mark Twain's life that either are in archives or not available anywhere else. So, and a lot of these letters have to do with the women, because they weren't collected by the archives in the same way that archives collected the business dealings of Mark Twain or other memorabilia like that. And I wanted to show you the picture on the right is the little logo of the Twainian, and as you can see, it shows the two porches that Howard Marshall talked about, and those would have added considerable storage and living space, but still, it's a pretty tiny house for a family. Anyway, Clara's second marriage after Ossip passed away was not as successful a marriage. Happily, by the time they started selling things off, because they kept running into financial problems, the Mark Twain Research Foundation was well established, and the members included many successful people who could afford to purchase the items and have them shipped to Missouri. So, among the items are lots of pieces of furniture, and I will emphasize big, bulky pieces of furniture that had been in the Hartford home. Clara took them with her to California uh, as she downsized. Every so often, they would move to a smaller spot. They became more cumbersome, and you can hardly imagine them being used in a ordinary, small apartment. But Clara was still alive when the final auction came, and she was able to tell people where things were used. So, for example, the settee, which is the bottom left, was used in the ground floor hall. And the Mayflower chest, with its carvings of a nude man and woman riding a chariot, and flanked by carvings of a lion's head, that was in the dining room, and Clara remembered it was usually stacked with sweets, particularly molasses candy for my sisters and me. This is another very heavy piece, and I think it's a mantle, heavily carved mantle, and I just include it as a sort of an example of the Victorian taste of the time. This is what the successful upper middle class had. This was gathered on one of their trips to Europe and shipped back. But the things that are the most interesting to me are the items that were owned by the Clemens women. And Clara saved things that had a deep personal value, were small, could be tucked into a box as they were shipped, and were somewhat valuable in a monetary sense. So, and maybe useful. She might have used them. This comb was owned by her mother, and the dish on the left is a baptismal plate. This one was Langdon's. They also have Susie's there. This teapot was probably, I would say almost certainly, the last gift that Sam Clemens gave to his wife, Olivia. It was given to her in February 1904 and engraved, and her mother died in June of 1904. And at the time that this was given to her, she was not a well woman. There are other things in the collection that just, have a sort of sentimental value. And one of them is this really exquisite fan. There were fans in use by the Clemens in Hartford. Hartford was kind of swampy in the summer, to say the least. And there was lots of stories of fans, and maybe one of the fans that figured in one of the stories was this one. Anyway, it's an exquisite piece, and it was owned by Olivia. There are also some items that came to the collection from a different direction. Jane Clemens was Sam's mother, and she had injury to her eye when she was a child. This is a pair of her eyeglasses that were rescued from Keokuk, and they were rescued by Jane's biographer, Rachel Varble. And here is a button string, and it didn't say on the documentation where this button string was found. It was rescued by Rachel Varble and given to the museum. If this was a button string that Jane had kept all the way to her life in Keokuk as the eyeglasses, then it was started when she was 12 years old, and probably finished when she was 12 years old too. And that was a long time to keep a memento like this. But a button string was something that girls collected when they were young, and when there was a folklore that if they had a certain number of buttons, 100 or 1,000 or something, they would meet their true love when they had enough buttons. This is probably my favorite piece in the collection, and this is Jane's red rocker. And in Jane's generation, red was almost a scandalous color. And so the teacher who gave her this rocker, he was a fellow boarder in their home, really knew Jane well and knew that this was Jane's color. She loved red, and her daughters despaired of keeping her from even trying. She would even try to wear it. Now, I said at the beginning that Clara didn't have too many items that belonged to her father, and that is true. With all of these lovely feminine items that we'll see, there's very few that actually belong to Sam. But here is one of his smoking pipes. Any Clemens fan knows that he smoked incessantly. So, gosh, I don't know how to get back to, oh, I guess I can click this little thing. Let's see what happens. Yeah. So next year we'll be together, I hope, in Hannibal, and you'll get to see all these things in person. So thanks for coming to the virtual meeting.